All right, so now we're going to talk about uh, standard level chapter 8, section C, chi-squared, calculator steps, critical values, p-values, and degrees of freedom. In your Oxford book, it's page 393. Okay, so they give you this example here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Um, uh, 80 people were asked their favorite genre of music: pop, classical, folk, and jazz. The results were given. So here we have our contingency table, and the chi-squared test was carried out at a 1% significance level. The critical value is this. Now, in the Oxford textbook, they give you the critical values that you need, but there's a table here that I have given you on the handout you should print out. And this will really help you for your IA if you choose to use this topic to write your IA. So anyways, at a 1% significant level, the critical value is 11.345, and you can see that on my table, 11.345. We'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so write down the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis. Null hypothesis, they shorthand, they're going to write it with a capital H subscript O. And if it's a null hypothesis, you take the two things, genre of music, gender, and you say that they're independent. When you're talking about alternative hypothesis, they're going to shorthand use the capital H subscript 1, and then you take the two things and you say they're not independent. So favorite music and gender are not independent. Do not write dependent. In fact, I'm going to write this down. Do not write dependent. Do not write dependent because that's not what Ivy wants to see. And there's a reason. I can talk about that later. Okay, question B says, show the expected values of female liking pop is 21. Okay, so total female is 40, right? Total pop people is 40, total females is 42. So you take those numbers, 40 times 42, and we divide by the total number of people. Okay, and we did this in the previous lesson in S8B. Now, whenever you want to find degrees of freedom, you always use this relationship. The number of rows minus 1 times the number of columns minus 1. So if you look here at the data, there's 2 rows, males and females. Okay, so I'm going to have 2 for R. And then if you look up here, how many columns do we have? Pop, classical, folk, and jazz. That's 4 columns. So I'm going to put in a 4 in for C. So 2 minus 1 is 1. 4 minus 1 is 3. Our degrees of freedom are 3. Okay? So that's why on this on this reference table, I'm using the degrees of freedom 3. Okay, now let's find out how do we find the critical value and the p-values. So I've got all the steps on the handout that I've asked you to print out, but even if you didn't print it out, you can write these steps into your notebook. Okay, so first we need to enter the data into our matrix. So in order to enter the data, the first thing I'm going to do is hit the second button and then the x to the minus 1 button. Let's zoom in a little bit. Okay, so on my calculator, I'm going to hit the second button, and then the x to minus 1 button is right here. Okay, so second, that means we're going to put in a matrix. Okay, and we're going to arrow over to access edit. So if I look here at my calculator, I'm going to arrow over to access edit, and I'm going to hit enter. Okay, now in this example, it's a 2 by 4 matrix, right? So my calculator, I'm going to say 2 by 4. Okay, and now you're going to see, okay, it only shows 3 of them. The fourth one is over here if I arrow over. Okay, so now we're going to enter our data. Okay, so what is our data? It's 18, 9, 4, 7, 22, 6, 7, 7. Okay, so now I've entered my data into the matrix. So I'm following these instructions, and I press enter after each one. Okay, and then now that I've got my matrix all entered in, I'm going to hit stat and arrow over to test. So here we go. I'm going to hit the stat button. Stat, bam. Okay, I'm going to arrow over to test. And then I'm going to go down to chi-square test. So I have to hit the down arrow. It's a little ways down there. There it is. And then I'm going to hit enter. And I'm going to say observed is A, and then I just hit enter, calculate. And then I get this value. Okay, so I'm getting the same thing that we see here on the screen. So we get a chi-squared of 1.6, a p-value of 0.654, and degrees of freedom 3, which we already knew. Okay, so here's the part that that you need to be aware of. Okay, and definitely should copy this down. Okay, so if your chi-squared critical value is, if the calculated value is less than the critical value, we accept the null hypothesis. If the calculated chi-squared value is greater than the critical value, we reject the null hypothesis. So we got a 1.62 for chi-squared, which is greater than 11.34. Okay, so since 1.62 is less than 11.34, so that means we accept the null hypothesis. Now, if we're looking at the p-value, whenever the p-value is greater than 0.05, we accept it. If the p-value is less than 0.05, we reject it. Here we got a p-value of 0.65, which is greater than 0.05, so we're going to accept the null hypothesis under both cases, using chi-squared calculation and using p-squared calculation. We're accepting the null hypothesis. So, therefore, that last question had said, state whether the null hypothesis is we're accepting and give your reason for the answer. Okay, so we're accepting that gender and favorite music choices are independent, and the reason, because they asked for the reason, is because chi-squared calculated was, what did we say? Was less than the critical value. Oh, yikes, you can't see what I'm saying. Less than the critical value. Give you a second to copy this down. And the p-value calculated. The p-value calculated was greater than 0.05. Okay, those are the two reasons, and this is accepting the null hypothesis. And that's what you need to do for your homework for section S8C.